The total liberation of Ukraine has just begun as Ukraine continues its campaign of de-Russifying huge parts of its territory. An all-out offensive is underway that has resulted in almost the complete liberation of the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. Putin's plans are ruined. His dream of creating a buffer zone is in tatters. Ukraine has started something massive, and Putin simply sits there paralyzed as he watches his plans crumble around him. Here's the headline. Ukraine has liberated almost all of the territory that Russia has claimed to have captured in Dnipropetrovsk. That's according to Major General Alexander Komarenko, who leads the main operational directorate of Ukraine's general staff. In a March 10th interview, he claimed that Ukraine has almost completed its pushback in the Dnipropetrovsk region, and all that remains is to handle a few of Putin's stragglers before regaining full control over the sector. Almost the entire territory of Dnipropetrovsk Oblast has been liberated, Komarenko said, before adding, "We'll need to finish work in 3 small settlements and clear 2 more." That final bit of work is ongoing as we speak, and if the past few weeks have shown us anything, Putin's paralyzed forces are going to be taken out sooner rather than later. They have no defenses, they have no plan. All that remains for them is death, injury, or capture, just as we've seen over and over in Dnipropetrovsk since Ukraine began its counteroffensive back in February. And that counteroffensive has delivered some amazing results. As Russia attempts to push deeper into Donetsk and Zaporizhia, it had intended for the territory it captured in Dnipropetrovsk to serve as a buffer zone that would prevent Ukrainian aid from coming. We'll cover why that's important later on, especially in the context of a planned spring-summer offensive that Putin has up his wretched sleeve. However, Ukraine saw these plans coming and sprang into action. Since February, Euromaidan press reports, Ukraine has conducted a huge number of offensive operations in the Alexandrivsk axis, which is something of a junction point between Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhia. A Russian push into this axis toward the end of 2025 had signaled Russia's intent to use this junction as a buffer. Ukraine has reversed everything. And according to Komarenko, Ukraine has retaken more than 400 square kilometers, or at least 154 square miles, during this operation, and is pushing to take more. Ukraine has been cementing its control of this territory, Euromaidan press adds, and it's been conducting follow-up sweeps in many of the areas that it's liberated to remove the last vestiges of Russia's infiltrating forces off the map. This is de-Russification made real, and there isn't much that Putin is able to do about the airborne assault forces and ground assault units that Ukraine has been deploying to make this pushback happen. That gives us an indicator of how Ukraine has made these massive gains. In its report on Komarenko's comments, the Kyiv Post also makes mention of these combined aerial and ground assault forces, as well as noting that the general himself confirms that this is a very deliberate and purposeful operation being conducted by Ukraine. This is a planned offensive operation that has passed all the procedures of approval, coordination, etc., Komarenko claimed. He also said, "Yes, of course, I repeat, the forms of warfare are changing. The content of operations, battles, combat actions is different." When he was asked whether what we're seeing from Ukraine right now amounts to a full offensive operation against Russia. This is an important point. It's not uncommon for Ukraine to liberate territory that Russia has captured. It has happened many times over the last 4 years, though it typically involves Ukraine retaking a small village or scrap of territory when an opportunity arises. What we're seeing in Dnipropetrovsk is different. This is a coordinated push that has been conducted over several weeks to de-Russify the entire region. That push is almost complete, and there are several reasons why it's so important that we'll cover soon. We can see that coordination in play with the actions of the aerial and ground assault forces, which have been coordinating to conduct systematic sweeps of all the settlements that Ukraine has liberated. The Kyiv Post adds that mechanized brigades that were already defending the Dnipropetrovsk sector have joined in on the action. They have likely been transforming themselves from defensive into offensive units as the sweep has been ongoing. The logic here is simple. The assault forces push into occupied or grey zone territory to de-Russify. The mechanized brigades that were trying to defend this territory then become part of the push, making it even easier for Ukraine to gain ground. And gain ground, Ukraine has, at an astonishing rate. Komarenko reveals that 400 square kilometers that Ukraine has liberated represent more than simple de-Russification. Each of those square kilometers is a signal to Putin that Ukraine can do what Russia's leader wants his forces to accomplish, even better than the Russians can. Thanks to these active actions, we have positive dynamics in February. More territory has been liberated than lost, Komarenko says, and he's backed up by figures published by the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW. In its March 3rd analysis of the Russian offensive campaign, the ISW revealed a snippet of information that will have Putin frothing in fury at the utter incompetence of his soldiers. For the first time since the summer of 2023 counteroffensive, Ukraine retook more territory from Russia than Russia managed to steal from Ukraine. This statement covers the month of February, and ISW openly admits that it's even likely underestimating the true extent of Ukraine's advance when compared to the 400 and 460 square kilometer figures that are being shared by Ukraine. ISW's mapping methodology underestimates Ukrainian advances, as ISW depicts the furthest assessed extent of Russian advances until enough open-source evidence emerges to allow ISW to confidently assess that Russian forces no longer hold these positions, the ISW declares. What it did say for certain on March 3rd is that the period between February 14th and 20th saw Ukraine achieve a net gain of 33 square kilometers, or 12.7 square miles, which means that Ukraine liberated 33 square kilometers more than Russia captured during this period. We saw even better during the next week, between February 21st and 27th, when the ISW claims that Ukraine enjoyed a confirmed 57 square kilometer or 22 square mile net gain. And now that we're in mid-March, the full offensive has gained even more ground. Russia's defenses have crumbled, and Ukraine is now shoring up a new front line that was once porous but is now being filled with defenses and fortifications that will make it incredibly difficult for Russia to retake what it has lost. That's going to have huge ramifications for what's to come as we move deeper into 2026. And the main reason why comes down to something that we've already mentioned several times already. Russia really wanted Dnipropetrovsk to serve as a buffer zone. Komarenko said as much himself, stating, "Their leadership constantly says that they need the entire Donbass as a buffer zone. Their goal was to create a buffer zone in the Dnipropetrovsk region. That was their intention, their plan." In other words, Russia has counted a whole bunch of chickens before they've had the chance to hatch in Dnipropetrovsk. Russia's main goal after the initial failure of the so-called special military operation has been to snatch the Donbass region away from Ukraine. Putin has stated this many times, and Russia has made it a key condition of peace negotiations. If Ukraine doesn't cede the Donbass, Russia will keep throwing meat at the grinder to take it by force. Ukraine isn't ceding, and that leaves Putin with a problem. Let's assume for a moment that Russia succeeds in taking the Donbass, which is far from a given. The last thing that Putin would want in this moment of triumph is to deal with attacks that Ukraine carries out toward the east via Dnipropetrovsk and Alexandriivsk, hence there is a need for a buffer zone. What Russia wants to do is create what would amount to a multi-mile strip of defense-laden territory that it could use to stave off Ukraine's counterattacking forces. The longer that Russia could stop a counterattack into the Donbass, the more time it would have to build fortifications in that region to make the success of a counterattack very unlikely. What this all amounts to is that Russia wants to expand its control over the front lines in eastern and southern Ukraine. Over the last month, Ukraine's campaign of de-Russification has made that impossible because it has eliminated the buffer that Putin so desperately wanted to create. Nearly every scrap of territory that Putin intended to use in that buffer is now back in Ukraine's hands, and Ukraine is pushing to reclaim even more as its offensive pushes deeper. That's going to have a huge impact on what happens in the Donbass region in 2026, never mind in a hypothetical future where Russia controls the Donbass, and we're going to explain why in just a moment. But before we get into that, if this is the kind of insight that you want more of, make sure you are subscribed to The Military Show. We break it down like this every single week. Now, why are Ukraine's massive gains in Dnipropetrovsk bad for Russia beyond the fact they've stopped Putin from creating a buffer zone that he intended to use in a future that is far from certain? One of the answers to that question is that a full offensive showcases that Ukraine has all the initiative on the battlefield right now. We see that in the fact that Ukraine is making stronger gains than Russia right now, which paints a picture of Russia's defenses crumbling as Ukraine's fortifications hold up. Emil Kastahelmi, who is a military analyst with Finland's Blackbird Group, backs that up with statements made to the Kyiv Independent. Over the last few weeks, Ukraine has been counterattacking, especially in the Dnipropetrovsk region. Generally, it's clear that the initiative in this sector of the front has shifted to Ukraine, Kastahelmi proclaims. The Atlantic Council agrees with this assessment, stating in a March 3rd edition of Dispatches that Ukraine has managed to weather the winter storm that Russia unleashed against its energy grid to come out on the other side with all of the momentum. In addition to liberating parts of its own territory, Ukraine is inflicting massive casualties on Russia, receiving billions of dollars in aid and loans, and has deployed new long-range weapons against Russian and occupied territory. Ukraine is far from the spent force that Putin has been trying to claim it to be toward the end of 2025, and the counteroffensive is the latest proof of that fact. Ukraine is also looking to build on this momentum, as proven by the country's defense minister Mikhailo Fedorov, setting a target of 50,000 Russian casualties per month to be reached by the end of 2026. These are not the actions of a nation that is breathing its dying breath on the battlefield. So we could see Ukraine's all-out offensive as a signal to Putin and anybody who believes the constant lies that come out of the Russian president's mouth. Beaten nations don't take more territory from the countries that are supposed to be beating them. Yet that's what we've seen in Dnipropetrovsk and the surrounding regions over the last couple of months. And now that weapons like the Flamingo drone missile hybrid are flying and Ukraine is strengthening and expanding its kill zones, 2026 looks set to be a year where Russia loses more than it ever has for whatever gains it manages to make in Ukraine. What we're also seeing is that Ukraine's counteroffensive is forcing Russia to divert resources away from its main goals in the Donetsk region. We'll come back to that specific point toward the end of the video, but when talking about Donetsk, we also have to talk about what Russia is reported to have planned for the spring and summer of 2026. An offensive is coming. Russia has been preparing for its latest push since the end of 2025 through sustained artillery and drone strikes across the front lines, along with its long-range attacks against Ukraine's logistical and energy infrastructure. The goal here was to force Ukraine into deploying reinforcements before it was ready, which just so happens to be what Ukraine has forced Russia to do with its counteroffensive. The New Voice of Ukraine carries comments from military analyst Alexander Kovalenko, who states that Russia's plan for the spring and summer of 2026 appears to be to conduct a push into the southern region of the Donbass. That would mean its forces move along the border between Donetsk and Zaporizhia, right in the region of the Alexandrivsk junction that we mentioned earlier. Alongside this push, Russia also wants to move toward the fortress belt cities in Donetsk, chiefly Slovyansk and Kramatorsk, so it can begin its efforts to topple the last line of Ukraine's defenses in Donetsk. But even before Ukraine's counteroffensive, it didn't seem likely that Russia would be able to make anywhere near the gains that it anticipates from its mid-2026 actions. It's unclear whether they will even be able to conduct a full-scale offensive campaign during the spring-summer period in this sector, Kovalenko says. This intended spring and summer push also brings us back to the buffer zone region we've already discussed. We looked at the buffer zone in the context of Russia having taken the Donbass, meaning it will be trying to protect what it holds. But Russia could be around 2 years from even reaching that point, and it's going to need a buffer as it tries to push deeper into Donetsk and Zaporizhia too. Politico reports that Putin's perfect situation would have been to have the buffer zone established before the spring of 2026, as that means the zone would have supported the offensive operations that Russia has planned in Donetsk and Zaporizhia. Ukraine's reinforcements would have been bogged down in the buffer if everything had gone to plan for Russia. In turn, this would have left the forces that Ukraine has in the regions that Russia wants to take isolated from support. It would be a smart strategy if Russia were able to execute it. But as we've seen so many times in Ukraine, Russia's grand ideas and the reality of what its troops can achieve on the battlefield are two very different things. Russia will still try to push in Donetsk, of course. Has to. At this point, taking that oblast and thus completing the capture of the Donbass region has become the only goal that Putin can even semi-realistically aim for. Other Russian plans, which were revealed at the beginning of March and involved deeper advances into Zaporizhia and, hilariously, given what we now know, Dnipropetrovsk, seem like pure fantasy conjured up by Putin. However, the push toward the Donetsk fortress belt has to be made in a situation where Ukraine can reinforce its defenses in the oblast. Stopping Ukraine from doing that was the entire point of the Dnipropetrovsk buffer zone. With that gone, Ukraine is solidifying lines that Russia thought it had well under control. Putin's forces have been pushed back or, in many cases, eliminated entirely. So if Putin wants to have any hope of actually creating the buffer that serves such a massive supporting role in his plans for the Donbass, he is going to have to commit time and soldiers to recapturing what Russia already thought that it held. And that brings us to another reason why Ukraine's final all-out offensive in Dnipropetrovsk is so important. It wreaks havoc with whatever plans Russia has for its manpower. We mentioned earlier that one of Russia's goals for its buffer zone was to force Ukraine to divert more of its resources to Dnipropetrovsk, forcing the creation of opportunities in the Donbass and perhaps elsewhere in Ukraine. Instead, what Ukraine has done is use small aerial and ground assault units, along with mechanized units and swarms of drones, to conduct a systematic search and destroy operation in Dnipropetrovsk that has wrested back control of territory that we now know is only loosely held by small gaggles of Russian infiltration units. With that job practically done, Ukraine has turned the tables. It's not Ukraine that has to divert resources, it's Russia. Komarenko explains what this means for Russia when discussing Ukraine's gains in Dnipropetrovsk and the Alexandrivsk axis. The most difficult sectors remain Pokrovsk and Alexandrivsk, when the enemy has concentrated its main efforts, but we are gradually stabilizing the situation thanks to our active actions, Komarenko reports per United 24 Media. He adds, the number of enemy attacks around Pokrovsk and Mirnorad has somewhat decreased as their forces were redirected toward the Alexandrivsk axis. In other words, Putin has been forced to push troops that he intended to use to capture key territory in Donetsk back toward an axis that he thought was safe. That wasn't the plan. It was all meant to be the other way around, thanks to the buffer that no longer exists. And what this all means is that Russia is now going to have to burn through soldiers that were sent into Ukraine for the push into Donetsk on another operation entirely. That's the last thing that Putin wants when Russia is already struggling to obtain the manpower that it needs to conduct the offensives that it has planned for the spring and summer. As the Moscow Times reported on March 2nd, Russia is getting so desperate to bolster its ranks that it started sending letters to the parents of young women from the Central Asian region. Those letters contain an offer for the daughters of those parents, for whom Russia is willing to pay $26,000 in return for 1 year of military service. And to compound Russia's desperation, these offers are being made to young women from Asia who are serving prison sentences, meaning Putin is specifically targeting those he sees as vulnerable to try to bring more people into his fight. This is the sort of thing that a country that is clearly winning a war would never have to do. Women don't typically serve on the front lines for Russia, though the country has mobilized some female soldiers in the past to serve as medical personnel. So the fact that Russia is making these sorts of offers to the parents of convicts, don't forget, tells us that it's not getting its hands on the soldiers and support personnel that it needs in Ukraine. That probably has something to do with the fact that Ukraine is now eliminating more soldiers each month than Russia is able to recruit, which has basically led to Putin deciding that he will take anybody that he can get to maintain the illusion of Russian control. That illusion has been shattered by the Dnipropetrovsk counteroffensive. Ukraine has played this all masterfully. It's taken advantage of Russian weakness in Dnipropetrovsk to liberate territory that Putin thought he held. Now, Putin has to divert troops back to the buffer he thought he created, which means more losses on the front and less manpower in the Donbass. And as all of this is happening, Russia is growing more desperate for manpower while Ukraine becomes terrifyingly efficient at wiping that manpower off the map. The spring and summer are starting to shape up to be a failure for Russia. At this point, Putin must be used to that. After all, his forces have utterly failed to stop any of this from happening. Ukraine's counteroffensive isn't some sort of flash maneuver that it pulled off in a matter of hours. Ukraine has been retaking territory for weeks in a concerted campaign that began in earnest in early February. We covered the very beginning of what we're seeing now in a video, so check that out if you want to learn more. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to The Military Show so you never miss our coverage of the Ukraine war. And thank you for watching.